Soon the German nation was to be alone in Europe, surrounded by an infuriated world in arms. The leaders of Japan were already conscious that their onslaught had passed its zenith. Together, soon Great Britain and the United States would have the mastery of the oceans and the air. The hinge had turned.
Hello. On the 17th of November 1943, Allied troops began their campaign against the Germans and the Italians in the Tunisian campaign, in the last effort to push the Axis out of North Africa and open the way to Sicily and Italy. And as you heard from Winston Churchill at the top there, that meant Germany would be surrounded in the last 18 months of the war. So why was this campaign so important, and who was involved? Best-selling historian Saul David joins to discuss Tunisgrad, the long-running fight to secure Africa. His new book is out and links are in the show notes. Plenty more great history is on the way, so please do share and subscribe, and if you can leave a 5-star review, I'd be most grateful. But until then, it's me talking with Saul David on Tunisgrad. Saul, welcome back to the podcast. Great pleasure to have you on.
Thanks so much, all. Great to be back.
And it's your new book, Tunisgrad, and this is, I guess you're producing a book a year, so well done. I mean, this is quite a significant event during the Second World War, the Tunisian campaign. So I was thinking, actually, it's going to be difficult to cover everything in 45 odd minutes. So I thought we could probably start by just explaining, I mean, Tunisgrad, obviously by its name, implies a similarity to Stalingrad, and it happens around the same time. So I wondered if you could sort of help the listeners just to give a bit of a background, because as you rightly point out in your introduction, in your prologue, it's not really a campaign that many people are probably as aware as they should be, and they should be because it's so significant.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we think of the key turning points in the Second World War. I suppose the two really obvious ones are in the Eastern Front, Stalingrad slash Kursk, the great battle in 1943, but it's really Stalingrad, in my view, that's the turning point, because that's the furthest point east the German armies, the Axis armies, ever get to. Real shock to the system, loss of the Sixth Army. They lose about 100,000 men, which is interesting. And we'll come on and talk about the statistics of Tunisgrad later on, I'm sure, Ollie. And the other big turning point, of course, is in the Pacific, and that's Guadalcanal, which is where the Americans stopped this massive eastern advance of the Japanese, who've just had an unbroken run of success in the start of 1942. And by the summer of 1942, there's a big naval battle, Midway, which the Americans win fortuitously, actually. They get a bit of forewarning of what the Japanese are up to, and they're able to counteract that. And they manage to sink 4 aircraft carriers to only a single one sunk by the Japanese. And this really is the beginning of the turning of the tide. But that's just by sea. The first land campaign that the Americans fight is Guadalcanal. It's a 6-month campaign, brutal attritional campaign, which I wrote about in Devil Dogs, one of my previous books. But it is a big turning point because it's the furthest point by land that the Japanese ever get to. And it's once they're pushed out of Guadalcanal and pushed back, that there is a slow contraction of the Japanese perimeter all the way back to the home islands. It's going to take a long time. It's a very bloody attritional struggle, but Guadalcanal is generally recognized as that turning point. Tunisgrad, or the North African campaign, which culminates with the Battle for Tunisia, is not seen as a major turning point in the Second World War. One of the reasons why it isn't is because it seems to be peripheral. If you think of the main fighting, certainly for the main fighting in terms of the defeat of Germany, you've got the Eastern Front coming one way, you've got the Western Front from the landings at D-Day, you've also got the Italians coming up from the bottom, all of whose stories I'll be telling in my forthcoming Twilight of the Gods book. But in my view, the real turning point happens in the spring of 1943. It happens in Tunisia. And it's when the Germans lose their sort of southern glacis, really. And by the way, this is their description of their redoubt in North Africa, not mine. Because as soon as you lose the North African coast, you lose control of the Mediterranean, and you lose strategically the ability to stop anyone attacking through the south of Europe, which of course is ultimately what's going to happen in Sicily, Italy, and later on in France in 1944. So you open up all those options. You also release an enormous amount of shipping. 1 million tons of shipping was estimated was released, because no longer do the Allies have to go all the way around Africa to supply their troops there, and obviously some of the other fighting going on in the rest of the world. They can go through the Suez Canal, which is going to save a lot of time. And it's also a battleground in which the Axis forces lose an enormous veteran army, 250,000 men, more than half of them German. And people often think, oh, well, it was just Italians, but it wasn't. It was mainly veteran German formations that Rommel, of course, the wily desert commander, had pleaded, please let me get them out to Hitler. And Hitler says, no, absolutely not. In quite an interesting quote, because he says, North Africa is vital for our war effort, and we're not withdrawing. This was in March 1943, when the writing was pretty much already on the wall. And he waits another couple of months, and of course it's downhill all the way as the two Allied armies are converging in Tunisia. And finally, this utter catastrophe takes place in which these huge armies are captured. Mussolini, the Italian dictator, is humiliated, and really it pretty much is the beginning of the end for him. He's toppled just a few months later. It is, as I write in the book, the beginning of the end for the Axis. That is, Hitler's going to lose his last major ally, fascist Italy, and thereafter will be fighting on alone. Now, the one person who did make the point that this was an absolutely major turning point in the Second World War was Churchill in his 6-volume history of the Second World War. And I'm just going to read you a quick quote from that, Ollie, because it'll kind of sum it up. But right at the end,
you can always quote Churchill on this podcast.
He's always worth quoting. But right at the end of the longest of the 6 volumes, I think it's volume 4, in which he talks about the North African campaign, he writes, and that volume, by the way, is subtitled The Hinge of Fate. He writes, further successes lay right before us, and the fall, or rather liberation of Italy, was near. Soon the German nation was to be alone in Europe, surrounded by an infuriated world in arms. The leaders of Japan were already conscious that their onslaught had passed its zenith. Together, soon Great Britain and the United States would have the mastery of the oceans and the air. The hinge had turned. So it's Churchill himself who recognizes that it was a key turning point. But I think a lot of historians since the Second World War, who maybe haven't even read that volume, have missed out on its vital importance.
Certainly. I mean, of course, for listeners of this podcast will be familiar. James Holland's been on Gavin Mortar to talk about the invasions of Sicily and Italy. So you can't do that without having gained North Africa. And then, of course, this is the vital campaign to do that.
That's right, and just one other quick point actually on that front. And I know James Holland feels very strongly about the importance of the Italian campaign being under-recognized. He's just taking on a lot of the points I've just made. I mean, when you get to Italy, you can now get your hands on the vital airfields at Foggia, so you can have a strategic bombing of southern Germany and Austria, and also the Plesty airfields in Romania, all of which were vital strategic targets and did a lot to degrade the German ability to continue the war. But you've also got this drawing into Italy of a lot of divisions that could, of course, either fought on the Western Front or the Eastern Front. And most importantly, I think I mentioned it before. If I hadn't, I'm going to mention it now. 2,400 planes are lost during the Tunisian campaign. Those are planes that can never be replaced. And what you see towards the end of the Second World War, as indeed I'm writing about at the moment, is the Germans fighting on the Eastern Front with basically no air cover. They started the 1940 campaign with command of the air. By 1944, they have zero command of the air, and it allows all these huge Russian advances. Yes, there are other factors, some of them connected to the Allies' degrading of the Germans' ability to replace tanks and all the other things they need. But the fact that they have no air cover, which is partly a result of a lot of these planes, but also they've withdrawn a lot of planes back into Germany to defend against these bomber campaigns, coming from Italy and coming from the United Kingdom, is a massive factor in the success of the Russians in 1944, which I'm afraid also some historians to this day still fail to recognize.
Yes, indeed. I just thought we could slightly back up because, as you do in the thing I like about Tunisgrad is that you really put everything in context, which helps with the North Africa sort of landmass. As a lot of it really is not as it is today. It was part of the French Empire, or what was left of the
Yeah.
French Empire. And I thought we could discuss that in particular because there are a number of, I mean, there are Free French involved in Operation Torch itself, which is the invasion of North Africa. But the French, I mean, I have to say, they rather disappoint me early on not only, of course, in 1940. I actually, this was a statistic I'd been unaware of, that only 7,000 of the 100-odd thousand French actually joined up the Free French Army, even though they were 100,000 were in the United Kingdom at the time, which was disappointing. But I wondered if you could talk about the way Churchill really kind of removed the French Empire in North Africa from the game effectively, therefore making Operation Torch particularly a more realistic proposition.
Yeah, and just to very quick before I answer that, very quickly to say a bit about Torch. I mean, the British and Commonwealth troops had already been fighting in North Africa, for 2.5 years before Torch before Torch takes place, and they'd gone back and forth across the continent. It's well known the story of Rommel landing in February 1941 to kind of bolster the Italians, who'd been given a bit of a hiding at the start of those series of campaigns. He has a lot of success, but he gets pushed back at times. So you've got this toing and froing across the desert, which only really ends when Montgomery takes over the 8th Army in August 1942. And as a result of that, plans what is going to be the big seminal battle, at least in Egypt, and that's the Second Battle of El Alamein, known to a lot of people as the Battle of El Alamein, but there were two. The first one was fought by Auchinleck a few months earlier, which is the defensive battle. And this is the first major defeat for Rommel, and it's a point at which his armies now are going backwards. So you could say, well, given that they got the edge over the Germans and Italians at that stage, why do they need another invasion? Well, they need it for the reason you've just explained, Ollie. They need it because they want to take French North Africa out of the game, partly for strategic reasons, because if you don't take French North Africa, there's a danger that the Germans and Italians are going to come back in there, even if you do capture Libya, which was the original stronghold of the Italians in North Africa. It's also going to deter Franco and the Spaniards from getting involved in the war. Hitler, of course, had wanted them to come in a lot earlier, and if they'd ever got their hands on Gibraltar, it would have been a big game changer in the Mediterranean. But there's also a feeling that this is something we can do in 1942. The big debate in 1942, of course, is the opening of the Second Front. The Americans are now in. They're very keen to get into Northwest Europe as quickly as possible. But Churchill and his chiefs of staff were adamant that if they went in 1942, it would have been a disaster. The Americans are thinking a kind of a small-scale affair. Something called Operation Sledgehammer was planned, which would have been about 8 divisions strong. But that in itself would have been an absolute disaster. They would have been hemmed in on the coast and eventually obliterated. And Churchill knew this, and he felt that this is going to do very little good for the Russian war effort. But if I get to North Africa, if I can, achieve all these things that I've already explained could come out of capturing North Africa and removing the Axis from it, particularly the opening of the Mediterranean and the tying up of a lot of Axis troops there. Because remember, it's not just the number of troops that Rommel had there. They pour in a whole load more when they realize the Americans and the British are landing in French North Africa. So then there's a possibility you can tie up those guys too, which is exactly what happens. As I've already explained, most of them are captured. But as far as the French are concerned, this is a chance to force Vichy France to choose, because since the fall of France in 1940, France is divided between two halves: the occupied bit of France, so German controlled, which is really the northern coast and the western coast, and then everything else, and that's known as Vichy France. It's a sort of collaborationist regime, technically neutral, but really under the German thumb. And the Allies were very anxious that sooner or later the Vichy regime would roll over and allow Germany and Italy to occupy the rest of French North Africa. Roosevelt, interestingly enough, who went against the advice of his chiefs of staff in launching Operation Torch, also was convinced that that would be the case. And he was very good at seeing a much bigger picture. He was very into air and sea power in a way that some of his chiefs of staff were kind of a little bit more rigid in their thinking, particularly US Army Chief of Staff Marshall, who really was just totally hidebound on let's get into Northwest Europe as quickly as possible and let's get to Berlin as if that was going to be easy in 1942. And we know, as you've already referenced, that it doesn't happen in 1943 either. They decide to go to Sicily and Italy in 1943, again sensibly, in my view. But Churchill managed to convince everybody, Roosevelt, and even Stalin in Moscow, who went to visit in the summer of 1942 to explain Operation Torch. He actually said, look, a lot of good can come out of this. And there is no other operation we can launch in 1942 while the Americans are still bringing over their troops and building up their supplies that will actually have any effect on the war but North Africa. And he was absolutely right. And people say, well, he was fixated with the Mediterranean and saving the British Empire. And of course, that was mixed in it, but those weren't his major motives. His major motives are, how can we do all these things at the same time? What is the most effective use of Anglo-American force in 1942? And it was invading French North Africa. Just to quickly explain to the listeners who may not be familiar with what the coast of North Africa would have looked like at that time. If you think of Egypt, and you've got obviously the Suez Canal, and then when you move west from there, immediately west, you've got Libya, which the Italians controlled. And then beyond that, you have the three French states in North Africa, and that is in order from east to west: Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. And the plan for Operation Torch is to capture the first two, because you can use enough air and sea power to do that, and the Italians and the Germans won't be able to stop you because their air cover doesn't extend that far out of Libya and out of Sicily. But once you're into Algeria, you can then quickly maneuver onto Tunisia. The reason this was a flawed plan, and the reason the start of the Tunisian campaign goes so badly wrong, which is the so-called race for Tunis, who can get to the ports of Tunis and Bizerta in northern Tunisia quickly and really control the country, is because they had too far to go. It's 400 or 500 miles, and they could only get there mainly by truck, by moving tanks. But all of this was going to take time. Meanwhile, the Italians and the Germans were able to hop over the short distance from Sicily to Tunisia. If you look at a map, it's really just I think it's about 100 miles, the gap between the two. It was going to be much easier for them to do that. What they needed was French permission. Now, the French had already given them permission to move supplies through their country. Would they allow them to bring in military forces? The answer is yes, because Vichy France, under extreme pressure from the Germans immediately after Operation Torch was launched on the 8th of November, the ruler of Vichy France, Marshal Pétain, orders his officials in Tunisia to let the Germans, initially the Germans and then later the Italians, in. And that's why they're able to win the race for Tunis.
And so the campaign itself in Tunisia, so you've got the American invasion from the west, you've got Alamein has happened, and so you've got the British coming from the east. But why is it then? Because it's a good 5-month campaign, I think. So what are the main reasons for? The Allies thought this would happen a lot sooner.
Yeah, that's the plan. They're gonna take Tunisia by Christmas. That's what everyone was promised, and therefore they can get into southern Europe. Well, the British are basically saying to the Americans, we're still going to go for Northwest Europe, but they were never really intending to do that. It's one step at a time. But yes, they're hoping to speed up the war, and it would have sped up the war because instead of capturing the whole country by the end of 1942, it takes until May 1943. And the real reason for that, well, there are two main reasons for that. One, the terrain. Tunisia is very hilly, mountainous country, desert in the south, but lots of mountains running through the center of the country. Very good defensive ground and not so good to attack in. And of course, we're moving into the winter period. So weather was very much against the Allies. They felt if they could win the race, as I've just explained, they could get in there before enough Germans and enough Italians could get into Tunisia to defend, but they lost that race. And another factor is actually the troops, and this goes back to my point about the assistance of the Soviets. The troops that the Germans were sending there were really good troops. They were sending some of their best people, paratroopers, panzer, experienced troops who, of course, would have been hugely useful elsewhere, and the remnants of Rommel's forces, which were still very effective. So all in all, you had an incredibly experienced fighting force with some very good German armor, including the new Tiger tank, which was seen by the Western Allies for the first time in Tunisia. That combination on the one hand, and on the other hand, as I've explained, the weather and the terrain and the extra factor for the Western Allies, particularly those that landed in French North Africa, they were inexperienced. The Americans had never fought in a land campaign prior to this. They were learning as they went along. And even those British soldiers who landed in French North Africa, so it was an Anglo-American force there, were inexperienced. They had come straight from Britain, and a lot of them hadn't seen any fighting. They'd been trained up, but no fighting. So you had a really inexperienced group of Anglo-Americans learning on the job, and they did learn on the job, actually. It's interesting how quickly they did learn, but a lot of mishaps at the beginning, a lot of disasters went against them. And so by Christmas 1942, it's not looking great. Yes, there's a kind of a need to build up more Allied troops in Tunisia, but it's not looking great. And meanwhile, Rommel is withdrawing steadily closer to Tunisia. And so what you get by the beginning of 1943 is a meeting of those two Axis forces, those two Axis armies, actually. So now you've got an army group. Technically, Rommel was in control, but they never quite give him the authority. And he's, interesting enough, Ollie, although he'd been a great favorite of Hitler's, probably Hitler's favorite general, up to the point of the Battle of El Alamein, he disobeys orders at Alamein to stand fast, which was Hitler's modus operandi whenever he was in a tricky strategic situation. He saved his army, but he lost the confidence of his commander-in-chief, the Fuhrer, who never entirely trusted him thereafter. And this is one of the reasons why, naturally, he should have been the army group commander in North Africa, but he's never given ultimate control almost until it's too late. And so there is an opportunity for both Rommel and his fellow army commander, von Arnim, to collaborate together in what they hope will be a series of successive blows against the two Allied armies approaching them. That's Montgomery's, which is coming from Egypt and Libya, the 8th Army, and then Anderson's 1st Army, which, although it's a British army, also has some American and French troops under its command. And the feeling is, if we can knock out Anderson's 1st Army first, then we can turn on Monty's army. So in military parlance, you defeat in detail, you defeat one after the other. And they came very close to defeating the 1st Army with a series of battles, one of which is very famous, of course, the Kasserine Pass, which takes place in the mountain passes of central Tunisia in February 1943.
Yes, so let's talk about that, actually. Kasserine Pass, it may well be familiar to some listeners. That's the Allied First Army.
Yeah, it's the Allied First Army. I mean, it sometimes gets confusing because General Anderson, who, by the way, Kenneth Anderson, not a very well-known figure in the Second World War, mainly because he doesn't command that effectively during the Tunisian campaign, should really have been superseded. Monty, who had very little time for him, was recommending his supersession. But Alexander doesn't, who's in overall command, doesn't take the thorny problem in his hands. Ike, by the way, was in overall command, but the field command, the field armies were commanded by Alex. And Alex he wasn't always as ruthless as he could have been, and he decides not to remove Anderson. And so Anderson's army is strung out along a series of mountain passes, as I've explained. And Rommel and von Arnim come up with this very clever series of plans to debouch, that is, to advance out of the mountain passes they hold and then attack the mountain passes that the Allies hold. And once they got to, there were two spines of mountains running through Tunisia, the east and west dorsal. And if you can get through both of those mountain spines, you're up into the plains beyond. And the idea for Rommel was, I can drive north, maybe even as far as the coast, and completely dislocate, a bit of a mini sickle Schnitt. This would be a repeat of the Blitzkrieg campaign of 1940, a part of which was undertaken by Rommel, and they can completely destroy the Allied armies in French North Africa before then and they can completely destroy the First Army before turning on the Eighth Army. Do they come close? I mean, they have a certain amount of success. They win a tremendous battle. The combined art. The Axis forces win a tremendous battle in February, on the 14th of February at Sidi Bouzid, when they come out of the Faid Pass. They destroy a big chunk of two American divisions, incredible humiliation for the Americans. And then in the next few days, another advance by Rommel's troops through the Kasserine Pass, again defended by Americans and defeated. But it's what happens next that's interesting, because despite those two successes, if it had been in 1940, there'd have been into the rear area of the French, and there'd have been virtually no resistance, as was the case. But the mistake that's made in this series of operations is that Rommel's original plan to go even deeper into the Allied rear has been overruled by Kesselring, who agrees with von Arnim. That'll be a risk too far. And so he orders this smaller, thickle cut, which actually takes Rommel directly into the face of the American and British reserves, which are coming down from the north. And they stop him, and in a series of counterattacks, actually drive him back. So people always talk about Kasserine as an utter disaster, a humiliation for the Americans, but they learn very quickly, as I mentioned, and both them and the British managed to stop Rommel. And he realizes, because he's at the edge of his, it was just typical for Rommel, always outrunning his supplies, that he's not going to be able to get any further, and he needs to withdraw back to his starting point. So yes, they incur more casualties on the Allies. Yes, they knock out more tanks. Yes, they take more prisoners, but for what purpose? It's a tactical success, but strategically, it doesn't get them any further.
And you've been mentioning these names, and that's the great thing about this campaign, is that you've Rommel, Montgomery, Alexander, Patton is involved here.
Yeah,
Eisenhower, of course, in overall command. I mean, all the great figures. Bradley, I've missed out, as he should be mentioned.
Omar Bradley.
Yeah, all these great names, Saul, are really, coming up against each other, both allies and as opponents.
Yeah, if you were casting a film, Ollie, if you didn't know the history of the Second World War, but you'd painted a story something similar to Tunisia, and you said to me, well, let's cast a few names, let's have some big names to put into the story. You'd have come up with all those guys, because one of the reasons why they are so familiar, by the way, is as a result of the Tunisian campaign. That's where they earn their spurs. I mean, Monty's already earned his spurs at Alamein, of course, but he sort of tops it off with a series of battles into Tunisia and up through Tunisia. And these are basically considered for the rest of the Second World War as the Allied army's first team. You've got Ike in his position. You've got directly under him Monty and Patton for a while, until Patton blots his copybook in Sicily by striking various unarmed hospital patients who are there for suffering from battle fatigue, and he basically calls them cowards. So he blots his copybook, and Bradley replaces him. But thereafter, and Patton is resurrected to a certain extent, is rehabilitated. He's given an army command in the Northwest campaign. All of these guys play a key role, and Alex, of course, goes on to be supreme commander in Italy. So everyone who's fought in the Tunisian campaign goes on to have a really significant role thereafter in the war on the Allied side. Rommel, of course, does too, although he's dropping down in Hitler's opinion, but nevertheless has given the overall key job of defending the coast of Europe from Allied invasion in 1944, which does not succeed, as we know. And von Arnim, who's the other senior commander, I haven't mentioned a lot of the Italian commanders, by the way. One very good commander called Messe, Giovanni Messe, who commands the Italian First Army, which sort of takes over from what had been Rommel's Panzer Army. Messe actually does very well in North Africa, but he goes in the bag, as does von Arnim. So those two are taken out of the equation. They're in prisoner of war for the rest of the Second World War. And it's really only the Allied generals who have an opportunity to show what they can do for the rest of the war. And also Rommel. Why Rommel? Because in March 1943, when just after he's tried to knock out the Eighth Army by a big aggressive attack at Medellin, and this is just after the Eighth Army's crossed into Tunisia. He's badly defeated by Monty. Another battle that's often forgotten, actually, the Battle of Medellin. It's a incredibly effective defensive battle. Monty's sort of crowing after I gave Rommel a good hiding. It's the last time those two will meet face to face. I mean, I know they do in Normandy, but literally face to face on the battlefield. And Rommel goes back to North Africa to plead with Hitler to save these veterans, and Hitler says absolutely not, as I've already explained. So Rommel wants to go back to North Africa to at least be with his troops, or at least he claims he does. And Hitler won't let him. He says, no, you're exhausted. Go and get yourself fit, and we'll find another job for you.
And there's a more junior German officer there as well, someone who'll make his name a year later in the Wolf's Lair, and that's Colonel von Stauffenberg. Does he have a relationship with Rommel while he's? Does he meet Rommel when he's out in Libya?
Well, he's attached to von Arnhem's army, and I have to say he fights at Medellin, and he may well have been in discussions with Rommel. I mean, there's a relative difference between their ranks. Rommel is a field marshal at this point, and von Stauffenberg is a lieutenant colonel. He's been given the job. Interesting, he's a brilliant staff officer, Stauffenberg. Forget about anything to do with the plot. He's an absolutely really clever man, brilliant staff officer. I've always been slightly dubious about talking about Stauffenberg in relation to the plot, because as you will see from the book, when I give a bit of his backstory, he's a kind of arch German nationalist who's very keen on the successes of German arms until things don't go quite so well, on the one hand, but also he doesn't like the gratuitous atrocities being committed by German troops and SS troops on the Eastern Front, in particular the murder of Jews, and that's pretty much when he turns against the war. But if you look at some of the things he's writing about when he's fighting in the Polish campaign, for example, he's talking about the Poles as a rabble whose only use is really to be used as kind of agricultural laborers. I mean, this is kind of very racist language, very kind of anti-Slav language. So he was an arch nationalist who believed in the power of Germany, felt that Germany needed to be restored to its original place of primacy as a military industrial power in Europe. He never changed that view. Those were pretty much his views to the end. But to get to that point, he thinks we've got to get rid of this criminal bunch who are running the country. And those, of course, are Hitler. But what's fascinating about his role in Tunisia is that he goes over there as the operations officer for a panzer division, the 10th Panzer Division, does very well, fights at Medellin, as I say, that's a defeat. It's during the withdrawal after Medellin that he is typically right at the front. He's quite a senior staff officer, but he's there with the troops trying to direct traffic and get them out of this kind of path, which is, of course, where you're very vulnerable because you're all kind of pinned together in a small area. And Allied fighter bombers come over and they strafe the path, and some of the cannon fire hits the car he's in. And he's incredibly badly wounded. And the reason all of this matters, Ollie, and I know you can see what's coming next, is because those wounds mean that he loses one eye, he loses one hand, his right hand, and he loses the two small fingers in his left hand. So all he's left with, apart from an artificial limb, which is fitted later, are these three fingers on his left hand. And the reason all of that matters is because when he's part of the bomb plot and he's putting together, he's getting the fuses, which is quite a tricky business, for the two bombs that he's got to blow up Hitler on the 20th of July, 1944. His hands don't allow him to prime the bombs quickly enough so that he only has time to prime one. He's kind of, while he's in the middle of doing this, he's interrupted and told, no, the meeting's got to start. You've got to come now. So he only goes in with one bomb. What he actually should have done is left both pieces of explosive in his briefcase, and one would have blown up the other. But he obviously didn't realize that, and so he gave one to his assistant, and the bomb goes off with only half its power. And as a result, partly a result of that, and partly a result because it's put behind quite a thick table leg, Hitler survives the assassination attempt.
And now you've covered Alexander and him not dismissing Anderson, but you have a chapter on Field Marshal Harold Alexander, and he's a big success story during the Second World War. But this is the campaign that I think he makes his reputation, certainly among the Americans. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I mean, he has a lot in common with Eisenhower, actually. He's a very good handler, a very good manager. This is not a great battlefield commander. I mean, I did say he was in charge of the field armies, but it's the best way to think of Alexander is someone who, can create the strategic big picture and then let individual army commanders like Montgomery fight the battle. So he's not a tactical field commander. He's a strategic big figure. He's a big picture person, basically. But he was a very good handler of men, as was Ike. The two of them got on very well. He was someone who would pick the right people, put them in the right jobs. I mean, as you know, when if you a lot of CEOs, he would have a lot in common with a lot of successful CEOs. That's really what they do. They can't be involved in all the micromanaging, and I don't even think that Alex had the skills. He wasn't considered to be that sharp attack. He wasn't over endowed with brains, but he had a great feel for people. He had a great feel for situations. He was brought in when things weren't going well, as I've explained in February 1943, and very quickly redirected the whole strategy. He basically coordinated everything and said, okay, the First Army has got to tell the Eighth Army what it's doing. If we can get the two armies to actually operate together and to link up, then we've solved half the problem. And then we're gradually going to restrict and confine and effectively squeeze the Axis forces in Tunisia in a vice between these two armies into a smaller and smaller area in northern Tunisia, and eventually we'll wipe them out, which is exactly what happened. Maybe not as quickly as he would have wished. He wasn't perfect. He didn't always act when he needed to in terms of the direction of his subordinates. So yes, on the one hand, he was very good at picking subordinates, but he wasn't always that good at interfering when they weren't doing that well. Anderson being a key example. He was lucky, I think, to a certain extent, Ollie, by having Monty as a kind of senior commander under him for most of his time. He loses Monty halfway through the Italian campaign, and the Italian campaign is never as effective, arguably, although James Holland may disagree with that, thereafter, because Monty, of course, goes to Northwest Europe. Monty himself had flaws. He wasn't perfect, but he was a very good battlefield manager. Everyone agreed with this. Alex says this, so does Ike. He was brilliant at organizing and executing battles. He made sure that he had all the resources that he required, and that meant at least double more than the enemy had. So famously at Alamein, he had twice as much as the Axis forces. My dad always used to say to me when we debated this, he said, well, he wasn't a very good commander. Rommel was much better because he could fight with fewer men, and that's true, but Rommel was a risk taker who wasn't always overly concerned with logistics. And those risks can sometimes get you into trouble, and they eventually did for Rommel, because when Rommel was out on a limb at El Alamein and he wasn't getting in enough supplies, it finished him. He couldn't maneuver on the battlefield thereafter, and it was the beginning of the end. And Monty would never have got himself in that situation. He never would have advanced so fast without the tail catching up. He was very concerned about logistics, and some people said he was overcautious, but one thing is for sure, anyone who served under Monty respected him. They knew that if they were going to fight a battle for him, there was a reasonable chance they would come out the other end. And I don't think you can say that for a lot of other field commanders on any of the sides in the Second World War.
Well, logistics are those kind of unsexy parts of commanding that are so important. I mean, Wellington in the Peninsula used logistics impeccably and was able to be, a great success, wasn't he? So it is that skill that you need, don't you?
Yeah, I think all the great commanders instinctively, or maybe through experience, realized. I mean, Wellington learned this in India, of course, where you've got huge distances and it is very difficult to build up supplies and transport supplies. And he realized there it was the absolute key to success. Carries this on in the peninsula in all of his major successes. And if you go back to a hero of mine in the late 17th century and early 18th century, and that, of course, is the Duke of Marlborough, exactly the same. He was a man who always took care of logistics first, and all the great field commanders do. And that's the truth of the matter. And I don't always think Rommel, that was the first thought in his mind. It didn't kind of play into his risk taking, dramatic at the front. there were many times where Rommel probably should have been killed, even as a general, because he was always up there at the front. The crossing of the Meuse in 1940, but even some of the battles in North Africa, he's far too close to the front, and puts himself at completely unnecessary risk. And truth be told, Ollie, the further you are to the front and the further you are away from your headquarters, a bit like Urquhart and Arnhem, the less you are able to direct things. The less you are able to actually manage the battle. So can be counterproductive. Sounds good, looks good, impresses the soldiers when they see you at the front, but how useful is it actually for the overall purpose of the war? Not hugely, I suspect, in many cases. So yeah, there were flaws there for sure on all sides. But I think Monty's, just to make the point, because I'm writing more about him in Northwest Europe now, I think he has been overly maligned by historians, partly because of character traits. He was, a very difficult, irascible character. Didn't suffer fools, but more than that, he was very abusive towards people, and he didn't mind who he upset. They're pretty sure now. I've seen quite a few accounts recently suggesting he had Asperger's. I suspect he probably did something similar. He was on the spectrum for sure.
Right. Okay. Well, look, we mentioned Alexander, and he, I think, was 23 when he commanded the Irish Guards, who make an appearance, in fact, very impressively, in the guise of Lance Corporal Keneally. And I was reading his story with great interest. And you describe his winning of a Victoria Cross brilliantly. It's really thrilling reading.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about the big picture a lot, haven't we, Ollie? Because, if you're going to give people a sense of why the campaign mattered and, who the key players were, all these familiar names of the generals and the field marshals are bound to pop up. But I've always been determined in all my books, actually, to tell the big picture, but also give a bit of experience of what it was like, at the sharp end for these ordinary soldiers. And Keneally, I loved his story because he's not even Keneally. That's a made-up name. He's someone who, who had a very shady past, a very kind of murky past. Like I suppose, like a lot of people who join the army as other ranks at that time and even today. And he left the army. It didn't work out with his initial posting, and eventually ended up in the Irish Guards. And he really found a home there, didn't he? It's quite interesting the way he talks about the training. He finds a family in the Irish Guards. He'd run away from home when he was very young. He didn't know his dad. He was, born an illegitimate. So he obviously had a very tough upbringing, but the army provided a proper home for him. They also gave him direction and discipline. All these things that we talk about that the military can sometimes do. Gave him a direction in life, and he found he was very good at it. Now, the Irish Guards, as everybody knows, all of the brigade of guards, you have to be a certain height to get in, and that was the case in the Second World War, pre-Second World War. But he was in the Queen's company of the Irish Guards, and those are the tallest guys. I can't remember the minimum height was something like 6'2", wasn't it, Ollie? Is that right?
Yeah, I think he says he's the shortest, and he's well over 6 foot. It's not the case nowadays, I don't think.
Yeah, but in any case, he's gone into the best of the best, as it were, and yet this is there's a lot of discipline, a lot of stuff that he wouldn't have been used to when he was growing up. And he was obviously a bit of a maverick. He sounds a bit of a criminal character when you read some of the descriptions of what he got up to. But something about the military and something about the guards fitted with him. He was a hugely kind of he was hugely admiring of the institution, both the army and the guards. Not the army in particular, because he'd already had his experience. It hadn't worked out in the artillery, but the guards he loved. I think he loved the kind of sense of self-respect. What you put in, you take out. And getting back to the point, he fights this battle in April 1943, when, of course, the Germans and the Axis forces, it's only a month before they finally capitulate. They're sort of on the run, but they're still fighting tooth and nail. And there's a series of battles as they're closing in on Tunis, in which the Allied troops are having to take various pieces of high ground. And the objective for the 1st Battalion of the Irish Guards was this feature known as the Boo. And they're only actually supposed to be attacking a section of it, but it's a really brutal battle in which they go in, they're pushed back, there's hand-to-hand fighting for a series of features. But what our hero Keneally manages to do on at least 2 occasions is take on a much bigger force of German counterattacking Germans on his own. literally just him and his Bren gun, and he manages to, at least in as far as his citation is concerned, disrupt these attacks and undoubtedly save not only a number of his colleagues' lives, but also the position that they're holding, which they managed to cling on to. So it's an extraordinary series of heroic acts by Keneally, replicated by others in many other instances, but maybe not quite to the degree of courage that he showed in saving effectively his whole unit from destruction.
I loved reading when when the regiment received the news of medals awarded after the action, and his name isn't on it, and he's sort of, oh, I thought I would have got a military medal at least. Oh well, but he's promoted to sergeant, and then he only discovers, I think, from the radio a few months later, an announcement that George VI is going to be awarding the Victoria Cross to him, and he hears that on the radio.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's so typical, isn't it? It does take a long time for the citations of the VCs to go through the various hoops that they have to go through before they're finally awarded. But no one even gave him an indication that he had been recommended. And as you say, he was disappointed not to get the military medal, which is the lowest grade of gallantry medal for another rank at that time. But the great thing about the VC is that anyone could win it at that time. And of course, everyone, if they could have had their wish, it would have been awarded a VC. So it really was something for this, this kind of orphan from this guy from a broken home from Birmingham where he was brought up, a ne'er-do-well actually going on to win the Victoria Cross. It's a wonderful story. And it's the sort of thing that can happen in war. I mean, war, for all its horrors, can also make people, and some of the best of people's characters can be brought out by conflict.
Yeah, and there are plenty of stories like that in this book, Saul. This is great. Thanks so much. This has been really enjoyable. And so I'll put links in the show notes for listeners, for Tunisgrad. But Saul, thanks very much.
Thanks, all. Can I just add? I
Yes.
don't know when this is going out, but if anyone wants to get hold of a pre-order copy of Tunisgrad prior to publication, which of course is 11th of September, then just go to the Waterstones website and put in Tunisgrad 25, and you'll get 25% off the book.
Very generous of you, Saul. Thank you.
It's all coming out of my pocket. Oh, brilliant.
Good stuff. All right.
That was great.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.